Okay, now let's look at the ITTOs. As usual, first the inputs. In the list, project charter is the first one. The project charter provides the high-level project description, product characteristics, and approval requirements. The next one is project management plan. Of course, project management plan is not a single document. Out of many, scope management plan is one of the key input in defining the scope. Let's look at it. You already have a good understanding about scope management plan. So let's look at the scope management plan in current context. Scope management plan details how the project scope will be defined, validated, and controlled in the project. Project documents. Primarily, there are three project documents that are used during defined scope. Let's look at them. Assumption log. The assumption log will contain identified assumptions about the project, product, environment, stakeholders, and other factors that can influence the requirements. Requirements documentation. Requirements documentation identifies requirements that will be incorporated into the scope. Risk register. What is risk register? In simple terms, risk register consists of every detail about the risk identified. Depending on the organization and the project, the risk register may contain little or a lot of information apart from just the list of risks, such as whether the identified risk is a threat or opportunity, the probability and the impact. Also, if it occurs, which project constraint will get affected, such as schedule or cost or quality, etc. The risk register may also contain the risk response plan and when the risk is likely to occur. Let's look at with reference to the current context. The risk register will give the high-level risk from project charter. The risk register may contain response strategies that may affect the project scope, such as reducing or changing scope, strategies to avoid or mitigate risks. Remember, you are in very early stage of the project, so the risk register may not have a lot of information. Only the high-level information will be there in the risk register. All right, now the next input is enterprise environmental factors. Let's look at some of them. Market conditions. Market condition describes what product, service, and results are available in the regional and global markets. Depending on the market conditions, some of the scope may be included or some may not be included. Personnel administration policies. Some of the examples are existing facilities and equipments, organizational telecommunication channels, organization style, culture of organization, stakeholders and customers, project management information system, risk appetite. If you don't know what is risk appetite, don't worry, we will have a detailed discussion in the risk management knowledge area. So just make a remark in your notes. And lastly, the software used to define the scope. The final input is organizational process assets. Let's look at some of them. Learning reviews. It includes learning reviews before, during, and after project and project phases. For example, identifying, capturing, and sharing lessons learned from the current project and other projects, lessons learned repositories from similar projects, policies, procedures, and templates for a project scope statement, project files from previous projects. All right, now let's look at the tools and techniques. First, expert judgment. For this process, the experts are who worked in similar kind of projects will be helpful. The next is data analysis. Alternative analysis is the primary data analysis tool that is used during defined scope. We already had a detailed discussion about it. So now let's have a quick recall relevant to this context. In defined scope, to meet the requirements, you have to identify the alternate ways. For example, you found that assembly of a car engine using the current process is expensive and time consuming. So you may have to consider looking out other way of doing the same, which takes less time and also cost effective without compromising the quality. The next is decision making. Here we have multi-criteria decision analysis. I hope you remember our earlier discussion on multi-criteria decision analysis. In that example, we discussed about choosing the right mobile that meets our requirement by giving different weightage to different requirements. Different weightage is given to each criteria. It gets multiplied by the specification. In current defined scope context, multi-criteria decision approach can be used for establishing criteria such as requirements in order to refine the project and product scope for the project. The next one is interpersonal and team skills. Facilitation. Facilitated workshop with a cross-functional team helps to arrive at a common understanding of project deliverables and project boundaries. The next is product analysis. Product analysis is a tool that is used to define the scope of the product. In Project Charter, the requirements will be at high. I hope you remember it. By analyzing the product through its scope, questions are asked about the product. By answering to those questions, the answer itself will help to describe the use, characteristics, and other relevant aspects of what to be delivered. During product analysis, the scope gets decomposed to the detail level as close as possible to the final product. Some of the product analysis techniques are product breakdown structure, requirement analysis, system analysis, system engineering, value analysis, and value engineering. Let's look at the outputs. First in the list is project scope statement. Defined scope describes the project deliverables in detail. This includes both project and the product scope. It contains the description of the project scope, major deliverables, assumptions, and constraints. The scope may contain the scope exclusion explicitly. That is, what is not part of the scope. It may be detailed as an exclusion. This helps to avoid the confusion between scope inclusion and scope exclusion. This helps to reduce, of course, the scope creep. What is scope creep? In simple terms, creep means something goes beyond control. So, scope creep is when the scope goes beyond control. In a project, every stakeholder wants something. It's highly impossible to fulfill every stakeholder's every requirement in a project. The project manager should be proactive to understand the stakeholder's requirement. If not, every stakeholder will pitch in into the project and impose their requirements. Just imagine if every stakeholders get into the project and impose all their requirements. How the situation will look like. Completely out of control, right? So this is called scope creep. The scope simply goes beyond out of the control of the project manager. In fact, one of the primary reasons of scope creep is not involving the key project stakeholders at the early stage of the project, especially during scope definition. I hope you remember our discussion on different kinds of stakeholders. The other important reason is there is no common understanding between the stakeholders about the project deliverables. This is because every stakeholder visualizes the final deliverable from their own perspective, not the project as whole, the big picture. It is the project manager's responsibility to involve all the key stakeholders at the beginning of the project and make them to visualize the big picture of the project. In fact, the project manager has to make sure that the key stakeholders involved and contribute to the project throughout the life cycle. This makes managing stakeholders' expectation easier. Having clearly defined the scope with explicitly written inclusion and exclusion assists the project team to do the detailed planning. The moment I say the detailed planning, do you get the picture of Gantt chart? Excellent. An activity will have a start date and end date and how long it would take, which resource will carry out this task, etc. More detailed and realistic plan will be possible once you know the complete list of tasks to be done. If not complete, but at least as detailed as possible. This forms the basis to create the activity list. As an output of defined activity, there are 4 project documents get updated. Assumption log. You have defined the scope, you have more details now. The earlier assumption might get changed and new assumptions may get uncovered. And it's a time to update the assumption log. Requirements documentation. While defining the scope, you may have new stakeholders and their own requirements. There could be new scope and or change in scope. Requirements traceability matrix. All the stakeholders and the requirements have to be tracked. A matrix is an easy way to do it. This matrix will be helpful to verify the project final delivery against the requirements of the stakeholders. Stakeholder register. As an output of defining the scope, new stakeholders may get added, existing stakeholders may no longer be part of the project, and they need to be removed. All right, that wraps up the ITTOs. Let's move to the next process.